Tonight on Insights on PBS Hawaii, warmer temperatures, rising sea levels, and less rainfall. Just a few effects of climate change scientists say we're starting to experience in Hawaii and across the Pacific. What can we expect in years to come? And how do we translate research into action to combat and adapt to climate change? We'll ask scientists, conservationists, and policy experts. Now, live in our studio, our host, Dan Boylan.
Resources. Chip Fletcher is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Geology and Geophysics in the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And that exhausted me, Chip. He is a recognized expert on sea level rise and has received an Environmental Achievement Award in climate change science from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for that work. He has with him tonight his third book on climate change. How immediate is the threat to Hawaii in your mind to global warming? We said that low-lying atolls are in trouble, but we'll just move up. I'll move up to Pacific Palisades and Pearl City, you know, up there on the hill.
That'd be fine if you have some drinking water with you. I mean, basically, the problems associated with climate change in Hawaii boil down to a 6% decrease in rainfall over the last 30 years, and that varies from 4% to as much as 9% on Maui. Increased air temperature, just the increased air temperature and heat waves that will happen with increasing frequency towards the end of the summer and early fall. Those have public health issues. Those have energy issues. People are going to rely more and more on air conditioning. Is our grid and our energy sources ready to deal with the increase in air conditioning, the drawdown on the power? Several people, several experts in this area have told me that we used to shut off our air conditioning in the evening and just enjoy the trade winds, but people are now finding that that's not comfortable enough, and air conditioning now is cranking through all night long. Sea level rise is a problem that is affecting all the islands. The oceans are warming, and they're soaking up a lot of the CO2 that we're dumping into the atmosphere, which is causing them to acidify. And that affects our coral reefs, and it affects the plankton portion of the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem that forms the basis of the food chain. Storms are more intense. When it rains, it's likely that rainfall will be, more of greater chance of it being a record breaker. So we get intense rainfall, even in an overall regime of less rain specifically. And when you get an intense short rainfall, most of it just runs off into the ocean and doesn't actually feed our aquifers.
I read an article also about, you're talking about the aquifer, and I believe that you're changing some of your views about what the water rising, whether it's seawater or whether it's actually fresh water coming up out of the aquifers. Well, do I have that wrong?
Let's define an aquifer as a body of groundwater that we use, fresh water that we use. Most of the aquifers that we know of in Hawaii are actually not threatened by sea level rise. Some of the aquifers are experiencing salinization, but that's because we're drawing water out of them too fast and we're actually sucking up the salt water beneath them. What you may have heard about is that along our coastal plains, as sea level rises, the groundwater that's underneath our streets and our homes is also going to rise. In fact, with 2 feet of sea level rise, 70% of the flooding in the Honolulu area will be due to the water table rising, not due to waves coming up over the beach, not due to marine inundation.
So and that's relatively new, right? I mean,
that's
recognition of that.
That's a bit of research that we've been working on, but we just got a paper published in Nature Climate Change, and there was a newspaper article on that about a month ago. And so it's a recognition that sea level rise involves more than just coastal erosion and more than just marine inundation. In fact, the groundwater table goes up and down with the tides. And many of the viewers may know of, at high tide, salt water comes up out of our storm drain system and forms little puddles around the manhole covers and the grates on the edges of the streets in Kaka'ako and Waikiki. That's salt water. That's sea level rise coming into our lives. There are no regrets steps that we can take For instance, the Watersheds Initiative, it makes sense whether or not there's climate change happening. It just makes sense to preserve our watersheds and to fence out ungulates and to take out the invasive species. It makes sense that when you build a house in the coastal zone, you raise it up on footings so that a tsunami or hurricane storm surge is not going to destroy the house. It makes sense to protect our storm drain system and our coastal highways that are getting attacked by high waves or coastal erosion. So there are no regret steps that can be taken right now that would, just on an increment by increment level, would go a long way towards adapting to the problems.
Governor Abercrombie wants to build Oahu's third city in Kaka'ako. Should the Hawaii Community Redevelopment Authority, HCDA, be worried about rising sea levels there? And if so, what should they be doing in 2013 since everything is still in the drawing board stage? Michael in downtown.
Yes, they should be worried about the effects of sea level rise. And we know an awful lot right now about what the potential effects of sea level rise will be. We understand that a global target, and Hawaii is included in this, of 1 foot of sea level rise by mid-century, and a global target of about 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. We can map the potential effects related to this amount of sea level rise, and we can then start talking about how are we going to adapt to this and what's our reaction going to be to these problems, because there's a whole spectrum of ways that we can react to the problem.
Yeah, throughout some of the stuff I've read about the work that you and others have done, I see the phrase computer modeling of the future, and I found myself going as a cynic, come on, computer modeling. How do you model and come up and say 3 feet?
This is not based on modeling. Satellites have been measuring Greenland and Antarctica for 20 years, and if you take the rate of ice loss on those 2 ice sheets, and you take the amount of thermal expansion of seawater due to it absorbing heat, you do the simple addition, and you get 1 foot of sea level rise 40 years from now, 37 years from now. So unless something amazing happens to stop the melting of the glaciers and to stop the heating of the planet, this is going to happen. We may as well start talking about it and figure out how we're going to adapt to it. Something like 25% of open ocean marine species spend some part of their life near coral reefs, so the ramifications would ripple out through the entire ocean.
Aaron says, how can there be global warming when we just had a huge snowstorm on the mainland? There's no global warming.
As the air warms, it holds more moisture, and so you get more intense rainfalls and you get more intense snowstorms. Also, the Arctic is warming, which makes the jet stream create big meanders. And when one of these big jet stream meanders comes down to the United States, it brings Arctic air down with it. With more moisture in the air, you get Snowmageddon, which happened a couple years ago. Snowmageddon that hit Washington, D.C., I think 4 years ago, and all discussion of climate change ground to a halt.
Yeah, government ground to a halt.
Yeah, government ground to a halt.
Snowmageddon. I like that a lot.
So as ironic as it seems, an intense snowfall actually can be tied to climate change. There are also unpredictable elements. For instance, this past year, the United States production of CO2 dropped back to 1992 levels. And it's because we've started drilling in new ways using hydraulic fracturing of shale beds and extracting methane. And on the East Coast, well, throughout the mainland where you need to heat a house or a building, it's not too hard to switch from an oil-based heating system to a methane-based heating system. When you burn oil or coal, you produce CO2, which goes up into the atmosphere and can last for over 1,000 years. When you burn methane, methane goes up into the atmosphere, and it usually only has about a 10-year turnaround time, and it can come back out that quickly. So this wasn't predicted several years ago, and now the United States has decreased its greenhouse gas production.
Yeah, hybrid cars and as well. And
right. Increasing the mileage. President Obama in his State of the Union address called for getting our transportation system, or at least our cars, off of oil-dependent system completely, and going into, removing the sort of tyranny of the gasoline prices that constantly affect all of our budgets, and just getting away from oil in our cars.
But economic recession has to have contributed to this too.
Yes, and also we had a warm winter. So, I mean, these are sort of the unknowns that could have been forecast, but everybody was completely surprised when we found out our CO2 emissions were down to 1992 levels.
Somewhere I read that in places like Nanakuli and in Mapunapuna, new drainage systems have been used to try to adapt to the problems of rising water. But are there ultimately those kinds of things are not going to be enough, right? I mean, those you can't. New drainage systems would be overwhelmed, wouldn't they?
It's a matter of timing. So I think adaptation can happen, over a time scale of a day, a month, a year, a decade, 50 years, 100 years. And I think there are things we can do over all these different time scales. So what they've done in Mapunapuna is they've put boots on the end of the storm drain system so that at high tide, the salt water has trouble coming up onto the streets. And now there are blocks of Mapunapuna that once again can be useful, and the businesses are doing much better because they're not flooded out by seawater every day. But this effect will have maybe a 20, 30, 40 year, 50 year benefit to it. When sea level rises towards the end of the century, and perhaps it's 3 feet, perhaps it's as much as 6 feet, Mapunapuna becomes a new arm of Kehi Lagoon, which is what it used to be before we filled it. So if we can get a couple of generations of additional use out of a piece of land, I think that's a very strong adaptation step that's been taken. There are a few websites out there that specialize in knocking down the latest climate science. And it actually is easy to build an argument against something that someone has just published that says climate change is real. It's not hard to pick at the statistics or to say, oh, what you're saying only applies for a small part of the world, or I have another data set which refutes what you've said. And some of the websites out there that do this have a huge audience, but they're getting their information from one source, and they're not seeking information from other sources. If you lead a fact-based life, if your decision-making is based on facts, then you owe it to yourself and the people around you and the community you live in to seek out all the best information. And the published peer-reviewed literature on climate change is enormous. It's enormous. And we should really stop referring to climate change as happening in the future, because it's happening right now in very meaningful ways.
Has anyone done a study on the sustainability of our water with all of the tourist usage? What are the alternatives? Has that kind of study been done?
If you were to ask the City and County of Honolulu Board of Water Supply right now, they would say that at the current rates that we're using water, including the 7 million tourists that come here per year, it's sustainable at that rate. Looking forward, we have to take steps to conserve water. We have to take steps because we know that rainfall is going to be less. So we have to start instituting processes now to account for that, or we will not be able to handle the 7 million tourists in addition to the residents that live here.
Yeah, almost 8 million this year.
Sure.
Almost 8
million.
Go
back to your time scale. I think that you can invest and have several generations of people, 2 or 3 generations, that live in an area before it becomes unlivable, especially if you build certain safeguards into the way that you develop a property. And if you have an intensely used urban area, you can actually pump down the water table and probably buy many years of additional usage. They pump salt water out of the New York subway system because it's an economic decision. A lot of this comes down to being an economic decision.
Given our limited ability to factor in complex wind patterns, will we ever have a definitive answer to the global warming question? If not, then what should we believe? Forrest says. You understand that question?
Not entirely.
I don't.
There's a definitive answer right now. Global warming is real. The tropics are expanding. The global winds have accelerated because the evaporation and the air circulation, the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, all of these have spun up because evaporation has spun up with the warmer air. So I'm not sure what he's getting at with the winds, but the winds have responded to warming in a way that science would have predicted. Every scientist I know sees that there is strong preponderance of evidence points to human production of greenhouse gases as causing global warming, and global warming is proven to exist. You can look at hundreds of different responses to global warming that you would expect to happen. Ecosystems are moving up to higher elevations to find cooler temperatures. The tundra, the line of of permanently frozen ground in Canada is migrating to the north. The boreal forest is migrating onto open tundra. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I've got a whole list. You know, I could read 40 different proven observation-based, not computer-based, not model-based, but observation-based ecosystem reactions to a warmer climate.
Now, what areas of Oahu would be affected by rising sea levels? Any well-known areas? Come on, lay it on.
The western portion of Waikiki, over by the yacht harbor, Ala Moana Boulevard. These are all, and the golf course on the Mauka side of the Alawai Canal. These are all areas that are vulnerable to 2 feet of sea level rise. 1 foot of sea level rise is going to hit roadways and intersections at high tide in certain areas. 1 foot of sea level rise could potentially cause coastal erosion on the order of 100 feet of erosion. There's just a basic rule of thumb of a 1 to 100 ratio between sea level rise and the retreat of the coastline. That falls apart, though, in areas where you have a lot of sand availability. But many of our beaches are already deficient in sand because we've wiped out the native sand dunes that used to be throughout Hawaii, and instead we've planted our yards and our walkways on them. That's sort of the bank account, the savings account of sand for beaches, and that's gone. So beaches are sand deficient in many areas, and when sea level rise continues to cause them to erode, they're going to erode quite dramatically. Public education is the foundation for change. I'm part of a grant from the National Science Foundation where we are doing a lot of teacher training, not only in Hawaii, but throughout the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands. And we hold workshops in American Samoa and Palau. And when you train the teachers, they can then train their colleagues and take it down into the classroom.